This is Talking Foreign Policy, critical look at Canada's role abroad, and I'm Eve Engler. Today, we're going to discuss a rapidly evolving situation around Canada's purchasing of fighter jets. Yesterday, Defense Minister Bill Blair said new Prime Minister Mark Carney mandated him to reevaluate purchasing 88 F-35 fighter jets from U.S. arms giant Lockheed Martin. It marks an abrupt shift on a deal that costs Canada 19 billion upfront, more than 70 billion over the life cycle. There's a lot to unpackage on this developing story. And to discuss this, we have Brent Patterson, who has been campaigning on fighter jet issues with the No Fighter Jet Coalition for a number of years here. First of all, thanks a lot for coming on Talking Foreign Policy, Brent. And can you just start off by describing the F-35 deal and what Bill Blair seems to have said yesterday, Friday?
Sure. Great. And happy to have the opportunity to talk with you. Basically, what we know via the media in terms of the purchase of the F-35s from Lockheed Martin from the United States, a deal that was announced in January 2023, so not that long ago, a deal for 88 F-35s with the stated cost of $19 billion, so in the range of about $85 million US per plane, with the idea that the first four would be arriving in 2026, so next year, and that they would roll out from there. I don't think the actual contract has ever been made public, so we don't have all of the deals. This is sometimes like the issue in terms of transparency. So again, this is coming from media reports. I don't know if it was previously reported that Canada had already paid for the first 16 fighter jets, but that's, I think established in the media now. So that would be beyond the first four next year. It would probably take the deliveries up to 2028. But that's the deal. Probably, again, it was in your intro, but really important to highlight that when the then Defense Minister Anita Anand announced the purchase, it was very much it's the $19 billion purchase, and it was almost a full year, or it was towards the end of 2023 that the Parliamentary Budget Office came out with the 74 billion total cost over the lifespan of the fighter jet. So well after that, although that information really had been generated by the Stop Fighter Jet Coalition, that information was out there. It was just more formalized or finalized. But it's definitely a crucial piece of the information. And yeah, in terms of this rapidly evolving situation, what we're seeing from Defense Minister Bill Blair, who, let us say, a week or two ago was not saying that this deal would be reevaluated. It was like, well, this was a long-standing process, and it went through a process, and we're not going to rip up the deal and all of that. And not that long after making that more, definitive statement that the deal stands, now it is in the process of being reevaluated. And so I think what we're hearing from him through the media is that the new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, has asked him to reevaluate the deal, whether it's in the best interests of Canada. There seems to be some speculation, or actually not speculation. He's saying that he's talking with other aircraft manufacturers. So this might be the Swedish company Saab that had the Gripen fighter had been part of that contest, as it were, to be selected for the fighter jet for Canada. That there seems to be some discussion, perhaps with them or other aircraft makers, and also the sense that um, oh gosh, it almost seemed like it could be like that there would be fewer uh, uh, jets, and so I don't know. We'll see how this plays out, and certainly there needs to be an important role for public engagement or people to be even questioning this whole broader piece about not just the F-35, but any fighter jet and whatnot. But it does seem to be a shifting situation, and yeah, and a really interesting one.
And when it was kind of like a rapid sort of uproar, if you like, among the public to some extent. It's not that wide, but there was a email campaign, and more than 4,000 people emailed Mark Carney. There was Michael Byers had an op-ed in the Globe and Mail. Then you had Yves-François Blanchet, the head of the Bloc Québécois, saying he was open. This is all like in the last few days, saying he was open to reconsidering. Then you had Lloyd Axworthy, the former foreign affairs minister for the Liberals, comes out and he says that it should be, scrap the contract. So there, and then on Thursday it got announced that Portugal was abandoning its plan to purchase the F-35, and there's a bunch of other Germany and stuff have been just media reports circulating around that. And so now the kind of big part of the sort of narrow concern here is about this question of U.S. control of the computer system. I don't know if you call it that exactly, and the upgrades, and this notion that they could have this sort of an effective a kill switch, as some have said, referred to it as over the fighter jets. And so, in the context of Donald Trump's sort of unpredictability of the business of 51st state annexing Canada, obviously also the trade war kind of stuff like that. All that made it seem a bit more questionable whether Canada should go forward with this. So can you talk a little bit about what we know about this sort of kill switch type thing, and then maybe a bit of that broader U.S. control over the F-35?
Sure. Well, again, what I've been able to glean through mainstream media, defense news analysis, and whatnot, I mean, it seems to be sort of unclear whether there's a kill switch per se, although that might be a helpful way or a good way to kind of understand the level of control or vulnerability around Canadian control of the F-35, in that it seems to be well established that the United States would have control over the software upgrades and the hardware upgrades to the F-35, and that those would have to be done in the United States, and that the United States or Lockheed Martin is retaining control of the source code for the software for the fighter jets. And so, I mean, maybe it can sort of get technical and whatnot, but it definitely, I think, reveals a level of vulnerability over a product. If we put something as awful as warplanes, call it a product, but it's a level of vulnerability over something that Canada is buying that could essentially be its utility being hobbled or diminished or disabled by not being able to upgrade software and hardware. Just, I mean, it's as simple as if we just thought of our laptops. If you couldn't upgrade it or add an app or whatnot, its utility, its usefulness is effectively degraded or downgraded. And I think this is the sense in terms of what you're talking about, how rapidly this situation is changing, is because you don't necessarily need to have a more radical or political analysis of how warplanes are used or the role of NATO or militarism or militarization or whatnot. I think in a mainstream sense, in a very mainstream sense, you can say this does not make sense for another country, particularly one now that's sort of threatening to make Canada a 51st state or undermining Canadian sovereignty or interested in the critical minerals that are present in this country, for that country to have control over arguably Canada's defense via its its fighter jets. It just doesn't make sense, on a very basic level. And so I think that's part of what's going on now. And kill switch is just a very helpful way to kind of go like, oh, okay, that's what that's about.
And so, yeah, it gets into this whole notion that we're told we're buying these fighter jets for defensive reasons, and as the U.S. becomes the clear possible invader, obviously it's a little bit questionable to give the possible invader control over the thing you're supposed to be buying to defend the country. Now, we know that that's not actually what this fighter jet, the F-35 purchase was about, is about, something different. And that gets into a bit about, Bill Blair alluded to this when he was discussed the issue reconsidering the F-35 on CBC's Power and Politics last night. And he's that the Canadian military wants the F-35. He kind of alluded to that. We've known that for a while. And so because for them, it's part of their alignment with their U.S. counterparts. They often refer to this as interoperability, the ability to operate seamlessly alongside the U.S. They say NATO, but really it's about the U.S. And I would say it's part of the Canadian military's kind of desire to be part of this leading global military hegemon, which of course is the U.S., and its sort of project of global domination. So yeah, I guess sort of what's your kind of comment on that in terms of that gets this offensive versus a defensive equipment, and then how it fits into the Canadian military's desire to be part of this global military machine.
Yeah, well, and again, the reasons for the leadership of the Canadian military wanting the F-35, I guess this is the stuff of speculation, but it seems to be well established that that is the case, that was their choice. I mean, John Ivison, no radical, no, anti-militarist activist writing in the National Post saying, look, it's clear the Canadian military wanted this particular jet, that the process in terms of selecting it, I don't know if he said it was rigged, but it was fashioned towards a particular outcome. I think probably we all knew that the F-35 was going to be the outcome of that process. So it's clear that they wanted it. It can be like this interoperability, as you say, with the United States. It can be from a Canadian military mindset, this association, this alignment with the United States, with empire as it were. It can be like all of the kind of the joint exercises, joint planning, joint culture, as it were, this identification on the part of the Canadian military with the U.S. military. It can also be Lockheed Martin has it's the massive weapons company. It has a large resource, sophisticated lobbying capabilities, kind of thing that brings on former Canadian military staff and whatnot. So it can be this combination of identification with the U.S., that probably understanding of the offensive role of the F-35 and the fighter jets for Canada, coupled with a highly effective, well-resourced, financed lobbying campaign by Lockheed Martin. I think some of those are the factors. And again, I think that's where all of that, those millions that are probably spent on lobbying and whatnot and sealing the deal, where in this particular moment, again, that's rapidly changing, where it just completely stands at odds with probably the average person in Canada who would go, this, again, as you were mentioning before, this makes no sense for another country, the one that now is more seen as a threat, having control over the software, the upgrades, and the access to the source code for essentially, I'm sure it'll be much more than that, but essentially a $74 billion expenditure of public funds. Like I think that's where that it's the sort of clash of ideas and dynamics is coming together right now.
Yeah, and I would say I think it's important for people to note this may be controversial to some people, but the Canadian military has known for a long time there's only one country that could possibly invade Canada, and that is the US. I think that we don't talk about that, and maybe people don't want to talk about it. And I'm not arguing when I say that. I'm not. The argument is not for let's prepare for a US invasion, let's bulk up, and as some people started, let's get Canada should get the atomic, nuclear bomb. So I'm not at all of that. I think what that leads us to is we should have be good neighbors with the U.S. and work with solidarity with people in the U.S. and have friends and try to de-escalate everything and that kind of stuff. But there is the Trump has said the quiet part out loud to some extent. I mean, this is if you think about it for a little bit, and the Canadian military is completely structured not to defend, but to be an add-on for the U.S. military. And that goes, in the Le Devoir about a month ago, this political scientist referred to Canada as like a Lego, as like an added block to another force, right? It's not, again, it's just not structured to defend. So that gets into it. And we also know that concretely, of course, it's not just sort of some abstract kind of discussion. It's like, what has Canadian fighter jets been used for, previously? And the F-35 is something new. And you're part of the No Fighter Jet Coalition. It's not the No F-35 Coalition. It's not the No Gripen Coalition. It's the No Fighter Jet Coalition. And there's an argument being made at a much bigger kind of moral level. So can you talk about that, about, spending tens of billions of dollars on warplanes rather than social housing, light rail, clean water on reserves? Yeah, that kind of the big picture of like what Canadian fighter jets has been used for and what, campaigning against fighter jets is from your perspective.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and I might start from the perspective of what the F-35, in one sense, is emblematic of the militarization of foreign policy. So, as you were saying before, rather than de-escalation or making friends or diplomacy or looking at ways to build peace or nurture, nurture understanding, diminish tensions or whatnot. It's the here bulk up and have these offensive first strike F-35s and or warplanes and whatnot. So it's in the context of that. It is also in the context of looking at the past 30 years or so of the CF-18 fighter jets that have been sent out on at least 1,600 bombing missions in other countries. And, I think this is also the kind of thing that maybe, again, in a mainstream sense, maybe Canadians think, oh, well, the fighter jets, they're going to fly above the snowy terrain of the Arctic and protect us from the Russians or, something like that, or what we see in the media, and, is that sense that they've been scrambled to do that. And I don't think necessarily that there's that kind of fuller sense of CF-18s, Canadian fighter jets, bombing water infrastructure and electricity infrastructure in Libya and Iraq and in other countries, and things that should be or are technically war crimes, violations of human rights. When you bomb electricity that generates the clean water, like the systems for clean water or water systems, you're depriving people of a basic human right. You're creating the conditions for cholera. You're creating the conditions for of mass displacement, of forced migration, of people trying to cross from Libya across the Mediterranean to safety, to the drowning of migrants in the Mediterranean. So I don't think we necessarily have that picture of how the Canadian military has been used in the past, but we really, I think, should develop that narrative. I think it's also the kind of thing that when we talk about F-35s, it's sort of like we just talk about it as an aircraft rather than, or at least it doesn't get sort of teased out as part of the narrative, is that comes along with billions of dollars being spent on missiles and bombs that fighter jet drops or fires, right? It's not just something that's going to fly around. It has munitions, it has missiles, it has bombs and whatnot. And again, I think the more that we kind of develop that understanding or that narrative and understand and have greater transparency about those expenditures, because that hasn't been so clear, I think, in the official process, but also to have a reflection on, like, the Canadian military will not say this is how many people on. So first of all, I mean, sort of it's gained through various media articles about how many bombing missions were flown. So it's not even like that's presented as an official figure kind of thing, like for public consumption or public debate. So you have to piece it together through various media reports over the years. But then it's not, again, like there's an accountability of Canadian fighter jets killed in those bombing missions. How many people? Like, is there an accountability for that? Is there a transparency or an information about that? Because I think that really begins to get to this sense of challenging this myth that, the fighter jet kind of flies around snowy terrain and protects the north of the country versus no, it's deployed around the world and it bombs infrastructure and it kills people in for offensive purposes and imperial endeavors, and there needs to be accountability for that. That needs to be understood. And then when we kind of say, okay, this is what's happening, this is what they're really used for, this is the damage and the harm and the lives taken that's resulted of their deployments, then we can begin to say, does the world feel safer, more at peace, more democratic, because billions have been spent on fighter jets and weapons and bombing other countries? Do we all feel more safe, secure, democratic, whatnot, or our rights? I think the answer is clearly no on that. And then you begin to say, well, what are the things that would create that world that we want? But it also generates, I think, the discussion that, oh yeah, rather than spending billions on weapons that kill people, that we could be looking at, investments in hospitals, investments in renewable energy, investments in social housing, or public housing, or any housing for all of us, all of the kind of the public goods, as it were, that are starved. And even from a basic calculation of job creation, there's lots of studies that'll show for every dollar or for every million or whatnot that's put into military goods, it creates X number of jobs. But if you put that into the things that actually benefit people, it's an exponentially bigger creator of jobs. And so in multiple ways, we can look at this in a bigger picture and should be looking at it. And I think, one of the really sort of unfortunate, I guess, dynamics of this is that it doesn't feel that we're having as full a public debate as we should, right? That that all of this information and analysis is out there, and people could completely disagree with what I'm saying, right? But it's more so like, shouldn't this information be out there more broadly? And I would say the mainstream media plays a role in this not being out there as fully as it should be, so that we just have a better public debate and public understanding about the bigger picture and where public money is put and how it's spent and what the role of the military is.
Yeah, I mean, there's two, three, four times as many jobs in particularly education
Mhm.
than there would be in producing fighter jets, which are of course very capital intensive. But the education, they don't hire former heads of the Air Force or Canadian Air Force generals who led the NATO mission bombing Libya in 2011, which is, as we see 14 years later, Libya is still divided and there's still different warring factions. That Charles Bouchard, what he did after leading the NATO mission was he, of course, worked for Lockheed Martin and pushing the Canadian government, the Canadian military, the Canadian public to support the F-35. So that the education lobby doesn't have people like that. Now, and we're not able to spend. Of course, that's part of being capital intensive and having these huge corporations that are able to spend on the lobbying, and the arms industry is very good at that. And anyone who's been in Ottawa knows they all have offices in Ottawa, but they don't actually produce things in Ottawa. Why? I wonder why they have those offices there.
Right.
Maybe it's to convince politicians and others to give public money to the arms industry. Now, one other question, going in a little bit of a different direction, I wanted to go to raise. So on February 25th, I asked NDP leader Jagmeet Singh if he would reconsider purchasing the F-35 in the context of getting, the conflict with Trump, and he was announcing at this press conference he was getting tough on Trump. He gave this long answer that had little bits of it that were interesting, but basically didn't say wasn't willing to say he would reconsider. So we're in this trade war with Trump. We're gonna do all these different things. The next day, in fact, he said at a Council of Montreal Foreign Relations, said he would exclude Trump from the G7 summit later that year. So he was really trying to take this. So I'm getting tough on Trump. We're gonna stand up for Canada in this Trump, but he wouldn't say we'd reconsider the F-35. Now, 2 weeks later, the government, Mark Carney, the investment banker, the has come out, and one of his early decisions, is telling his defense minister to bring this up, reconsider this. So I think that this says, obviously, it says a lot about NDP cautiousness. I think it also says a lot about the changing political climate, where things are moving quickly. And there's, I think, from the standpoint of peace, anti-war, it's called even anti-imperialist forces in this country, there's some opportunities in all this sort of the chaos of Trump, in saying the quiet part out loud, partly, and also in all so many horrible things that Trump's of course doing, but within that there's some opportunities, and obviously the whole question of going at the Canadian military's ties to the U.S. There's hundreds of agreements the Canadian military has with its U.S. counterparts, and also maybe more broadly in terms of calling for an independent Canadian foreign policy. What's your sort of thoughts on that and the sort of changing political climate? And again, opportunities. I don't want to sound sort of cynical, but there is some, politics have weird dynamics, and that does lead opportunities to raise things we've been campaigning on for many, many years that don't get much traction, and all of a sudden they get more traction. What's
Yeah,
your
yeah, yeah. No, it's a great question, a great intro. Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, it's unfortunate that the NDP leadership missed that opportunity, and in a sense, kind of have been outflanked, yeah, by the investment banker, as you say. Like, well, it's not exactly like an investment banker, seems more left now than the NDP, but like there is a little bit of a missed moment there, and yeah, and maybe it speaks to a cautiousness or I don't know, and the degree to which one can link. Um, I mean, at this point, the NDP dropping in the polls to that kind of timid, approach to foreign policy, or just generally, yeah, it's a good question. I do think, as you're saying, or I agree with what you're saying, that the political moment that we're in right now is with Trump in the United States is creating an opportunity, given fundamental relationships or fundamental understandings are shifting, changing in terms of I don't know. I don't think 6 months ago people were booing the U.S. anthem at a hockey game, kind of thing. Like it'd probably be unheard of, or all of the various things that are happening now, or this sort of elbows up kind of nationalism. I guess that's happening. That has its own challenges and probably a critique that we could offer of that too. But still, it's generating this moment to ask questions. I mean, I think for many years there has been the argument that Canada should withdraw from NATO, that it's a highly problematic military alliance. And I don't know if this moment or debate has necessarily taken us fully there yet in the broader public consciousness. But in the sense of the United States president talking about invading Greenland, quickly, member of NATO through Denmark, or the sense of this, at least an aggressive stance towards Canada, to NATO member countries. And what does the NATO charter say if a NATO member country is attacked, in terms of the kind of the collective security provision or whatnot? Well, how does that work when it's a NATO member attacking another NATO member? And whatever one's analysis or take on it, it's sort of like, oh, that throws up into question this whole, uh, issue, and a matter that may have seemed that is important but has been marginalized in terms of public debate, starts to come to the center in terms of like it being a viable public discussion. So yeah, I mean, I think we're in an interesting political moment, and as important as it is that there's been this kind of rapidly shifting narrative around the F-35, I think it's important for progressives and activists and anti-imperialists and whatnot to be thinking about, well, what does this also say then about membership in NATO, about relationship to the United States, about militarized foreign policy, about reprioritizing where public dollars are spent. I mean, we're living in a fraught and difficult time, and I mean, maybe too. I mean, within this too, maybe there's a different way to talk about. I mean, Canada essentially put probably $1 billion into the development of the F-35. Canadian companies are producing component parts for the existing F-35s that are in operation. I mean, there is this company, Gas Tops, that produces these engine sensors for the F-35 that keeps it in the air right now. The F-35, it's been documented, has been used in airstrikes and bombing of Palestine, of Gaza. It's essentially, or arguably, it is in fact being used to commit a genocide against the Palestinian people. Hopefully, in sort of the narrow mainstream debate about elbows up and should we buy F-35s, we can expand public debate and discussion and that narrative about, look, Canada has also contributed to the construction, to the development of a warplane that is committing genocide against the Palestinian people. That is, I think, one of the places that we need to move this broader question about what is Canada doing, the role of, militarism, militarization, and so on. And so it's it's an awful time in many, many ways, absolutely. Like it's full of uncertainty, but yeah, part of I think our role is to find some resiliency in it to move the debate forward.
The man who is calling to annex Canada is also calling for us to increase military spending. So we should think about maybe we should go the other direction, right? He obviously doesn't see the Canadian military as a challenge to his annexationist plans. He sees it as a contribution to the U.S. war machine and the U.S. Empire. So I would suggest that we go in the direction of real sovereignty, real elbows up, is cutting the military budget. Not you want to see some anger from Donald Trump. You want to see reaction from the power sources in the U.S. and the Pentagon and the Lockheed Martin, the arms industry. Start cutting the contracts. Start going in the opposite direction. For people who want to get more information, the No Fighter Jet Coalition has a website, nofighterjet.ca, I believe it is. And this F-35 question will be continuing to play out over the next weeks and months. Thanks a lot for coming on, talking foreign policy, Brent, and discussing the matter.
Great. Thank you so much.